Today we're looking at British Columbia native plants exclusively. And these are plants that are found in British Columbia. They're often found elsewhere. Some of them are found across the Northern Hemisphere, and some of them are local to the Pacific coast, but I'll do those all in turn. The first plant I want to talk about is Acer circinatum, which is what we call the vine maple. And it's not a vine, although Europeans, when they first saw it, thought that it might be a vine because the stems are green and it's a shade-tolerant plant that forms very, very horizontal stems, and they'll often lie on the ground and kind of wander around. So they call it the vine maple. But it, in the sun, it forms a kind of strongly upright tree. It's not unlike the Japanese maple, and in fact, it's a member of the same group of maples, the fork-branched maples. The difference between this and Acer palmatum, of course, is, well, there are a number of reasons, a number of features that differentiate it. One is that the number of lobes. This has normally 7 to 11 lobes, and you'll notice that the sinuses are fairly shallow. And a close-up will show the serrated margins. So quite different from that perspective. And also very, very green stems until they get in the sun, and then they become a little bit more reddish. But it's a very adaptable plant, tolerates our summer dry conditions better than, say, Acer palmatum. The samaras are small, about the same size as those of Acer palmatum, maybe a little bit bigger, and they tend to be very wide-spreading. The flowers, you don't see the flowers at this time of the year, of course, but the flowers are a little bit showier than those of Acer palmatum. They are white and purple, and I think when we do the review, I think I have a picture that shows that. But anyway, this is one of 3 native maples in British Columbia. So the second maple, native maple in British Columbia, is the largest of our maples, and this is a maple that has the largest leaves of any maple in the world. These are not particularly large, but they can be almost 60, sometimes 75 centimeters across. And you'll notice from these leaves that they're very, very coarse. They're coarsely toothed. They have very, very large, broad sinuses, and typically 5-lobed, but sometimes 3-lobed. Smaller leaves can be 3-lobed. They have a really gigantic petiole base, and that's because they have a very long petiole, and they need something that's going to be able to support that big leaf. Now, this is a tree like the vine maple. This is a tree of the Pacific coast. This runs north to about halfway up British Columbia and south about halfway down California. And it's, again, tolerant of our summer drought conditions, but only when it's established. And you find Acer macrophyllum in areas that tend to collect water. Although, like almost all maples, well-drained soil is important. So beyond the big leaves and the long petioles and the very, very long internodes, one of the easiest ways to recognize the big leaf maple is the samaras, and the samaras are big and bristly. And they're so bristly, in fact, that they'll actually poke you. They can draw blood. And so we have to be careful when we collect the seeds. I want you to notice that petiole is longer than the leaf is long. That's a good 35 centimeter petiole. So that tells you something about the phyllotaxy. It allows the tree to place the leaves and not be shaded. So Acer macrophyllum is a sun-tolerant plant. It's a little bit happier with a little bit of shade, but it's perfectly happy in the sun, and obviously tolerates shade. The shadier the conditions, the bigger the leaves and the longer the petioles. In the spring, before the leaves emerge, the flowers are produced, and the flowers are actually quite large. They're among the largest of all maple flowers. They're probably nearly a centimeter across, but they're borne in very long, drooping panicles, and they look like kind of a yellow squirrel tail as they hang from the trees. And they are very, very rich in nectar, and so they're very important for bees in the spring. So this is Cornus sericea. Sometimes you'll see this listed as Cornus stolonifera, but in any case, Cornus sericea is named for the sericeous hairs. That means, sericeous means long, silky hairs that are produced on the backs, mostly on the back midrib of the leaf. Now those are shed fairly early, and so we don't see them at this time of the year. In any case, cornus, typical cornus, opposite leaves, beautiful wavy margin leaves. The pinnate veins are arcuate, just like any other cornus. But this is a shrubby cornus. This is known as the red osier dogwood. Osier is a name that was given. It's actually a French word. Osier means willow stems. And so this is a little bit like a willow in that it grows, it's a suckering shrub, and it grows flexible stems. The buds are pointed, the axillary buds are pointed, and the stems are typically very, very red in the sun. Green in the shade, but red in the sun. And so this is actually a fairly attractive plant in the winter once it loses its leaves, in that if you have a background that shows up that red, you have these multi-stemmed suckering shrubs with red stems. And this looks particularly good near water or with snow behind it, or that kind of thing. This is a native right across North America, and this particular Cornus sericea in British Columbia can grow to, if you can believe it, 10 meters tall. So it's not tree-like. It's still very shrubby, but it can grow very, very large. The way that we deal with this in the landscape is to, because it's a suckering shrub, is to remove the oldest branches right to the base, and that encourages regrowth from the base. And so if we do that on a regular basis, then we can kind of keep things down to a reasonable height. Flowers are borne, small white flowers borne in a broad corymb, a little bit like a hydrangea, without the flag flowers. And then those are followed by little white berries, little white, actually they're technically drupes, single-seeded berries, and they're very quickly taken by birds. So this is Gaultheria chalon. Gaultheria chalon is known as salal, and I think that's a First Nations name for this plant. Now this is a member of the Ericaceae, but it doesn't look very much like a rhododendron. Of course, Ericaceae is a big family, and there are lots of different kinds of plants in the family. Alternately arranged leaves. This is what we would call a rhizomatous shrub. A rhizome is a horizontal underground stem, and so what it does, this plant, once it's planted and established, it produces rhizomes that spread out through the soil, and so you'll get upright stems coming from an ever-widening network of rhizomes. As I say, these are very, very leathery leaves. They're evergreen, and this is a shrub that in the sunshine will typically stay below about 1 meter tall, but in the shade can grow anywhere up to 5 or even 6 meters tall. So if you're hiking in the forest on the west coast of Vancouver Island, you'll often run into thickets of salal that are 5 meters tall. And this is, you might not even recognize them as salal because all the leaves would be over your head. But a shade-tolerant plant that will tolerate the sun as long as there's adequate moisture in the soil. But like so many ericaceous plants, this is a plant that really needs to have well-drained soil. And it can actually grow in almost pure sand as long as there's moisture that the rhizomes and the roots can get to. This is a very pretty plant in flower. It has beautiful white, pinky white flowers that are urn-shaped, and they have little bristly hairs all over them. Very, very pretty. They are followed by these berry-like fruits. And this is the actual technical description of this fruit is complicated. It's actually a dry capsule that's surrounded by a fleshy skin that's produced from the calyx of the flower. But that's a sort of technicality that you don't need to worry about. Very, very stiff branching. It's interesting, we occasionally get calls at the Botanical Garden from people who want to know how to get rid of salal rather than how to grow salal. It is really a tenacious plant once it's established and once it's in a place that it likes. And so we typically tell people, not to fight it, just cut it back. If you can cut it back very, very hard and it springs back, and you can keep it low that way. So always looks good unless it's allowed to dry too much in the summer, or you can kill it with too much moisture. Now this is another plant that we would, another native plant that's common right across the northern hemisphere. And this is Myrica galli, G-A-L-E, pronounced galli. And this is a shrub. It looks a little bit like an osier, but the stems are a little bit more brittle. And this is a plant that is what we would call a marginal plant. It grows on the margins of lakes and streams. So it needs a lot of moisture. Well, actually, it doesn't need a lot of moisture. It tolerates a lot of moisture. So it can actually grow in regular garden soil if you chose to do that. It's a little bit of a kind of a billowy, large shrub, and so probably not appropriate for this sort of more formal garden. But in any case, this is a shrub that'll grow to sort of 2 or maybe 2.5 meters tall, small blue-green leaves. It's an aromatic plant. When you brush by it or you bruise the stems, it has a nice sort of sweet resinous aroma. Flowers are produced in the upper axils of the leaves. They're very, very tiny right now. They're like little cones right now, but they become catkins. These are the male catkins, and they're going to shed pollen in the spring, and then the female flowers are going to pick up that pollen, and it's a small dry fruit in any case, but not anything particularly ornamental. The leaves and the habit of the plant, on the other hand, are very ornamental in a kind of an unstructured way. If you have a wet area, and you would grow that as a shrub next to a pond, for example. So in looking at the arrangement, this is an alternate arrangement, but you can see the spiral phyllotaxy. So we might call it a spiral arrangement, but alternate is good enough. The leaves are typically oblanceolate. That is, they're lance-shaped, but with the broadest portion of the leaf toward the distal half. So this is another Western North American native plant. This is a rubus. Rubus are the brambles. Rubus includes blackberries and raspberries, among other things. This is Rubus nutcanus, which is known as the thimbleberry. Now, up until just a few years ago, you would find this plant listed under the name Rubus parviflorus, which was a name that was given after it was given the original name nutcanus, but nobody noticed nutcanus until, as I say, just a few years ago. In any case, Rubus typically have alternate arrangement, and they often, if they don't have a compound leaf, then they typically will have a palmately lobed leaf. And in this case, this is beautiful 5 to 7 lobes with serrated margins, a very, very maple-like leaf. The easy way to recognize Rubus nutcanus, other than the leaf shape, is the hairs, the velvety hairs that are all over the leaf. So particularly when the leaves are just emerging, you can see the beautiful gray velvety hairs all over the shoots and the leaves. So Rubus are often prickly. So raspberries and blackberries are good examples of prickly Rubus, but Rubus nutcanus is not prickly at all. It barely has, if you run your hand along the stem, you can feel little bumps. They're sort of proto-prickles, not really anything that you're going to even grab on foliage. Now, I'm just going to go back to that and show you that the flowers are produced at the tips of the stems, these little corums with very, very large white flowers. They're probably 2 centimeters across. It's a very, very showy plant. The flowers are produced, of course, after the leaves are already out, so you have a beautiful background for those flowers. And then they quickly, if they're pollinated, they quickly turn into little they look like sort of flattened raspberries, a dull red flattened raspberry. They're delicious if they're ripe. They're a little bit dusty tasting if they're overripe and dry. But there are a lot of people who collect berries on the coast, and a lot of people will say this is their favorite berry. It's a very different taste, but delicious all the same. Now, this is a shrub that will grow probably to 2 meters or maybe a little bit more than 2 meters, but the stems are fairly lax. That is, they're a little bit weak, and so the whole plant kind of lays down a little bit so that you'll get a nice big rounded shrub of a plant. But you'll also notice that much of the bulk of this plant is in the leaves and the petioles, and once they're gone, this is a very, very kind of sparsely branched shrub, so it doesn't look like much in the landscape. This is Rubus spectabilis, and Rubus spectabilis is another Western North American native. It's reasonably closely related to the raspberry, and if you look at the fruits of a salmonberry, they look a little bit like a raspberry, maybe a cross between a raspberry and a blackberry. Shiny, red drupelets. If you think about a raspberry is a fruit that's composed of a whole bunch of little tiny fruits that are stuck together. And the same thing is true of the salmonberry. Interestingly, salmonberry produces red fruit and amber fruit. And that's just a single gene that designates whether or not the fruit goes red or the fruit goes yellow. And there's sort of populations around that are sort of equally either yellow fruited or red fruited. The flowers are hot pink, the kind of magenta pink, very, very attractive. They're not born in large groups, but they are so showy, and they're produced before the leaves. Usually, the flowers come out at about the same time as you're writing exams in the spring, sort of the first week of April. And they indicate, if you remember Ribes sanguineum from last week, they indicate the time that the rufous hummingbirds are coming back on their northward migration from California. And so spectabilis means showy, and indeed this is a very, very showy flower. So once the flowers have dropped off and the fruits start to develop, the leaves become expanded, and this is a very, very, just like Rubus nicanis, this is an alternate arrangement, but the leaves are very, very distinctive. They are compound, but this is what we call a pedate arrangement. Pedate means like a foot, and it's not like your foot, it's more like a duck foot or something like that. But notice that we have a terminal lobe that's bilaterally symmetrical, but the lateral lobes are not symmetrical. They're symmetrical, they're only symmetrical if you look at the whole trio. So that's a pedate leaf. The other thing about salmonberry is that salmonberry is prickly toward the base of the cane. And so in bramble fruits, we typically call these stems canes. We call them that because they're not permanent. They only last for 2 or 3 years. And so with salmonberry, no prickles at the top, but quite prickly at the base. This is a plant that a lot of people would call a weedy plant. It grows in ditches and anywhere that there's moisture. It's shade tolerant. The thimbleberry is you're more likely to see the thimbleberry in the sun and the salmonberry in the shade. So this is another member of the rose family. Rubus, of course, are members of the rose family. This is spirea. You've already seen a spirea. This is our native spirea, again, very, very widely distributed across northern North America. And like Myrica gale, this is a shrub that you find on the edges of ponds and streams. And generally speaking, this is a plant that requires some moisture, kind of year-round moisture. The stems, this is a sort of meter-long stem, and this is typical height. This Spirea douglasii will grow maybe 2 meters, but generally speaking, it will bend down. And as it bends down, then axillary buds along the stem will grow, and those will grow up, and then they'll bend down, and so on and so forth. And so what you have is you have a thicket-forming shrub with stems that are bending all the time, and that makes it very, very difficult. If you're trying to get through a thicket of Spirea douglasii, it's very, very hard because of all these sort of interlacing stems. And this is the reason that it has the common name hardhack, because you're trying to hack away at it, and it's very, very difficult to actually make any headway. So, like a typical rosaceous plant, alternate arrangement, the leaves, like a typical spirea, are simple. They're not compound, they're simple, and they're toothed. And in Spirea douglasii, they run the gamut from fairly large, sort of 10 centimeter, down to very, very small, maybe half that size or even less. Typically, they're grayish on the back of the leaf, and the flowers are produced in terminal panicles. There's a beautiful terminal panicle. There are hundreds and hundreds of flowers in this panicle, and they are bright pink, or kind of a bright soft pink, when they emerge in the spring, and they'll go like that for a couple of weeks, and then they gradually turn brown. And these are all seed heads. These are all capsules with thousands and thousands of seed in them. And so once you have Spirea douglasii, you'll never be without it because it tends to flower heavily and seed heavily. And if it likes where it's growing, it will certainly spread. So it spreads not only by seed, but also by those stems that lay down, and they root as they lay down on moist ground. Symphoricarpus albus, the snowberry, aptly named for the white fruit. Symphoricarpus are members of the Caprifoliaceae, and that family, which is the honeysuckle family, has a couple of recognizable features. One is opposite leaf arrangement. The leaves are not toothed. The leaves have entire margins. But in Symphoricarpus albus, this is a kind of an odd plant in that vigorous shoots, very, very strongly upright shoots, often produce lobed leaves. And so these are kind of crazily lobed. They're not, they're sometimes symmetrical, but usually not symmetrical. And so I'll show you a couple of those. Notice that the fruits are nearly sessile. That is, they're not produced on long stalks. The flowers themselves are very, very tiny. They're tiny tubular flowers, like little miniature short honeysuckle flowers. And they're typically borne in pairs, but in an inflorescence that has numerous pairs. And that's why you get this congested, all these congested fruit. These are also known as ghost berries, for obvious reasons. And First Nations people knew that these were they're not poisonous as much as they're not good for you. And so they were used for very specific purposes and not generally eaten, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Now, this is a deciduous shrub, and once those leaves fall off, which won't take long, then you have these beautiful kind of wiry branches that are covered in these white fruit. And typically the birds will take red fruit first, then orange fruit, then yellow fruit, and then white fruit last. And so, all things being equal in terms of ripeness. So the birds will generally leave these unless it's a lean year and they're all hungry. And so this is actually quite showy, and it looks like little tiny snowballs on these wiry stems. Now this is actually, like salal, a fairly aggressive plant once it's in a place that is suited to it, and that would be in well-drained soil. The difference with this is it can tolerate any sort of drought that we can throw at it. And so it's a kind of an ideal plant for the Vancouver area for that reason. And but it's not a shrub that you would grow in a formal garden because it's a little bit loose. I mean, this looks pretty impressive like this, but those stems are kind of loose and open, and there's not much foliage on it. So good for a wild area. This is Vaccinium ovadum. This is another native plant, but this is only native to the extreme west coast of southern BC. It's a little bit on the tender side. If we go inland at all, it will not tolerate a continental type climate. We call this sort of a zone 8 plant. So it's good. It's a great plant around Vancouver, but it's really only native to south of here and west of here on the islands. An evergreen, as I say, vacciniums are members of the Ericaceae, and they're typical in that they don't produce clustered leaves. They produce leaves that are all down the stems. So that rhododendron thing with clustered leaves, that's very, very common in the family. And so when plants don't produce clustered leaves, we make a point of that if they're in the Ericaceae. So Vaccinium ovatum, the leaves are ovate, generally ovate and toothed, small leaves, red stems, very, very pretty white or pinky white, urn-shaped flowers like salal, but tiny flowers, and equally very, very small berries as well. And these are little blueberries, and if they're ripe, they're delicious. There's a cultivar, a selection known as Thunderbird, and that was a selection that was made by one of the research scientists at UBC Botanical Garden many years ago. And that has slightly larger fruit that are covered in a glaucus, that is a bluish wax. So they look blue rather than black. The typical color for Vaccinium ovatum is these little black berries. These have an interesting, the branching is almost a radial phyllotaxy. So they don't lie flat, they kind of jut out in various directions. And this is a shrub that will grow no more, in cultivation at least, no more than about a meter tall. If you go again on the west coast of Vancouver Island, you'll find Vaccinium ovatum growing over your head. And it often, in fact, grows there as an epiphyte. That means it grows on top of other things, like on stumps or on tree branches and the like. But then the west coast of Vancouver Island is very, very humid and it doesn't suffer the sort of extended drought that we do here in Vancouver.